I'd like to share with you some of the exciting experiences I've had simply because I'm a Baha'i that I would never have had just as a judge of the United States Court. I was a delegate to the United Nations Women's Conference in 1975 in Mexico City. I was going to give a talk for women of the West, and Mrs. Sadat, the wife of President Sadat, was going to give a talk for women of the East. So she invited me to Cairo to meet with her in her palace before the conference. It was a wonderful meeting, and what happened was we found that we had much in common. I explained to her the Baha'i principle of the equality of women and men, equality of education, equality of opportunity. And then she said to me, I was then Dean of the law school, Dean Nelson, can you explain something to me? You have universal education in your country, and yet you have the highest rate of divorce, of crime, of domestic violence and the like. How do you explain it? And I said, as a Baha'i, I believe that education needs to be more than just material education. It needs to be spiritual education, which includes learning how to use your knowing and your loving qualities in service to the world of humanity. She said, is that what Baha'is are about to do? And I said, we hope so. So I met her again in Mexico City in 1975. I also met there the Queen of Iran and the wife of the Prime Minister of Israel. And I came back to my university and said, as International Women's Leader, let's invite Mrs. Sadat, Mrs. Rabin of Israel, and the Queen of Iran to receive honorary degrees. Well, I went before the Board of Trustees and they approved. Unfortunately, Minister Fahmy of Egypt, who was no longer with us, didn't approve of Mrs. Sadat coming. So she had to bow out at the last moment. Unfortunately, Mrs. Rabin was held up at the airport in Israel, a problem with bringing money out of the country. But fortunately, the Queen of Iran came, and I was privileged to give her an honorary degree at the University of Southern California. Well, this became important because when we were in Mexico City, Mrs. Sadat had a key. And she had invited me and a number of women to come. But during the proceedings, when Mrs. Sadat was speaking, the Queen of Iran was called to a newscast to be interviewed. And when I went and met with the tea, she said, oh, well, the Queen of Iran walked out on me. I said, oh, no, Mrs. Sadat. I was sitting right next to her. She had to leave. Oh, well, maybe that will be all right. Well, it takes me back. When I went back to Egypt, I had been invited to Columbia Law School to participate in a conference with judges from 15 countries about what should, various topics dealing with world constitutions. My topic was the role of women. I walked into the seminar room. I was a little nervous. There was one of my participants from Egypt, this judge, and I'm going to call him Judge X because I don't want to get him in any trouble. But I walked up to him, and he had a cigarette in his hand, and he was tapping it. And it said all around the room, no smoking, no smoking. So I ran down the hall and spoke to the dean and said, this delegate from Egypt needs to find a place to smoke. She said, well, if you must smoke, take him to room 210. I walk in and said, Judge X, I so admire Mrs. Sadat. He said, well, Americans like her better than we do. And I thought, oh, that's not a very good beginning. So then I said, well, what I like about her is she has gone back to get her education, has gone on television, and yet she believes strongly as we do. And he said, what do you mean we do? And I said, well, I'm a Baha'i. Baha'is, he said, heretics. I said, oh no, Judge X, that's quite mistaken. We revere Muhammad and we revere the Quran. And I said, at any rate, Mrs. Sadat believes strongly in the family, but she also believes that women, as the first educators of the children, ought to be educated. He said, well, we'll talk later. I go into the seminar, and my good friend, who is president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aaron Barak, I was invited to sit with them when I was in Israel. I've been in Israel back and forth since 1965. But he said, Dorothy, do you know who that man is? Judge X is the chief prosecutor of the Baha'is in Cairo. And at that time, 7 Baha'is were condemned to die because of a law that said no more than 3 Baha'is can ever be in the same room unless they're related. These Baha'is had been picked up in Tanta in Egypt and were condemned to die. I said, oh, Aaron, you've got to help me. We were assigned to the same limo going back and forth to the Carlisle Hotel, and he would say, D. Nelson, the Baha'is really revere Muhammad, do they not? I said, of course, as we do all the holy messengers. D. Nelson, the Baha'is really revere the Holy Quran. And I said, yes, they do. Well, back and forth. Last day, we're at a dinner with the United States Supreme Court members present, and Judge X and his wife were sitting at one table with one Supreme Court justice. I was at another. I got up and went over and said, Judge X, I've enjoyed talking to you so much. And he looked up at me and said, yes, yes. Well, I came back to my hotel room and called my husband and said, the Baha'is are doomed, because during our conversations back and forth, I had mentioned why the Baha'is were being persecuted. Well, the morning that we were to leave, his wife called and said, they called me Dean Dorothy and later called me Judge Dorothy, may we come say goodbye? And I said, I'd be very honored. And they came down, brought me a beautiful tapestry, and we said goodbye. That was a Sunday. Tuesday, shows how long ago it was, I received a telegram. Dear Dean Dorothy, I have decided to release the Baha'is. My wife and I hope this makes you happy. Your friend, Judge X. It all started with a cigarette. Then later, in the late 80s, more Baha'is were imprisoned. And the Universal House of Justice called and said, do you think you can make a trip to Egypt? And I said, of course. My husband had gone off and on, interceding for us. But this time, I offered to give talks at the university to get myself invited on mediation, which of course Baha'is believe in. And Judge Amir had a dinner for me. And he said, oh, Judge X said, you know, this is a very political thing. You've got to tell Baha'is to obey the law. They're not supposed to meet. This time it was 40 Baha'is. And I said, you're quite right, Judge Amir, but surely they should not be condemned to die for their religious beliefs. Well, he had a scholar in Islam come to our hotel, and he talked to us for 3 hours about the faith. My husband was the prime person who engaged in this conversation. So we came home, and I was hoping to hear this time late 80s, was email. And this time I was Judge Dorothy. 1 week went by, 2 weeks went by, 3 weeks went by, and my heart sank. Finally, an email came. Dear Judge Dorothy, my wife and I want you to know that we have postponed the trials of the Baha'is. Now, postponing the trials means basically they'll never be brought to trial. Again, please tell the Baha'is to obey the law. We hope this makes you happy. Your friend, Judge X. That culminated in my experience in Egypt. The joy of meeting the Queen of Iran at Mexico City at the United Nations Women's Conference was made more joyous by the fact she invited me to Iran just before the revolution. And I phoned the House of Justice. They said, by all means go and take your husband. And I said, well, he would love to come too. So we went to Iran, and that meant we got there a day early, checked in at the hotel, and went to Shiraz. We were able to see all the holy places, stopped in Isfahan, went and saw the holy places. We came back to our hotel, and they had locked us out. They had tried in Isfahan to take us off the plane, but a Baha'i owned the airline, and my husband had his card, and he pulled it out, and they put us back on the airline. But it was sort of the Americans. We felt hostility. And we got to the hotel, and they said, we're sorry. In fact, the National Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran said, if you're seeing the Queen, you must stay in the penthouse suite. So we were in the penthouse suite, but we were locked out. And my husband said, there must be a mistake. The man said, sorry, your trip is canceled here at this hotel. Again, we pulled out the card of a Baha'i who was owner of the hotel. And my husband said, please call this gentleman. He looked at the card. Oh, we have made a mistake. And they set us up to the suite, sent flowers, sent candy, said we could stay as long as we wanted. Well, a limousine came to pick me up. My husband waited back for me to go to the palace. The limousine driver said, you're meeting with the Queen. How can that be? And I was very open. I said, I'm a Baha'i. I am thrilled to be meeting with her. I met her in Mexico City, and she invited me to meet with her. Well, we went in the guardhouse. I was searched, and there was a long walkway to the palace. On the long walkway, 2 dogs. They were little spaniels, came up. I had a blue silk suit on, and they were jumping all over me. I thought, oh dear, I can't wait till we get to the door. We walk in the door opens, and the dogs go in too. And we go upstairs to the waiting room. And I had a 15-minute interview with her. She had set me up to visit the Rug Museum. I was to speak to a group of women at lunch and so forth. Well, I went in to see her. She was so beautiful. I felt very humbled by her gorgeous appearance, but she said, may I ask you a question? I thought only Persians were Baha'is. I said, oh no, of course, as you know, I'm a Baha'i. She said, how did you become a Baha'i? And I explained to her about how I'd been raised as a Christian, and then in law school encountered discrimination against women, and a Baha'i in our class stood up. So then she said, how would you like to have some English tea? I like English tea. Do you like English tea? And I said, that would be fine. But already 20 minutes had gone by, and I thought, I'm not going to end this interview. So we talked about education of women, the importance of the education of girls. And she said, you know, when I was a little girl, I was sent to Esfahan to visit my grandmother. There were no schools for girls in Esfahan except the Baha'i school. So my grandmother sent me to the Baha'i school, and I loved it so very much. And then she said, you know what? Have you had this Persian melon drink? Would you like to try it? Well, by this time, about 40 minutes had gone by, but again, I was up to the Queen to end the interview. And we talked on and on about the education of children, how spiritual education had to be combined with material education, that unless we dealt with the virtues of honesty, trustworthiness, loving kindness, and so forth, well, we were just in complete agreement about everything. An hour and a half later, she said, oh, I think I've kept you too long. And I said, oh no, Queen Farah, it's been my honor and pleasure. When I went out to the waiting room, it was just packed with people that had been waiting for us to come out. But what I had noticed in her beautiful office, she had a picture with Mrs. Sadat. They vacationed with her children in Alexandria in Egypt. And of course, when the Shah was deposed, they went to Egypt, and over the next few years, I would run into the Queen, I would run into Mrs. Sadat. I made a video for the United Nations about the importance of the education of women. But had I not been a Baha'i, I would never have enjoyed those wonderful experiences. One of the wonderful times I've had as a Baha'i is going to China. My husband and I went to China 8 times because, frankly, as a Baha'i, we really believe that China is the country of the future. And so I was very fortunate when the president of our university called me in 1989. I was a judge, but I kept teaching at USC for the first 5 years, and then it got to be too much. Would you take a Chinese law professor in your course on law reform? She is not a lawyer, but she's very interested in taking your seminar. I said, I'd love to have her. And so Mu Danping arrived in her Mao suit. I had 20 in the seminar, and we had one of the great experiences of our lives. Part of my course was to study about a certain aspect of the court, say the juvenile court, or the probate court, or the criminal courts, and then we go on field trips. On one of the field trips to the child dependency court, there were children testifying about how they had been abused. The courtroom was filled. Children were in the jury box, even it was so filled. Mu Danping stood up and said, Your Honor, remove these children at once. They should not be listening to this testimony. Well, my class got removed, and then I explained to Mu how the American system worked. When we went out, I required my students to spend 1 day in jail in a penitentiary, in Chino State Prison. And as we were going around, Mu was extremely critical of the overcrowded conditions. I explained to the superintendent of Chino that she was a visitor and she was a guest, and I learned later in China, regardless of what is done with political prisoners, that their jail terms are much shorter than ours, that they put 8 in a room, bunk beds, 8 teapots, a little stove, a library, maybe a bookcase of several 30, 40 books, and they are allowed to have a quilt from home. And so the atmosphere in the prisons is quite different. Everyone, we went in several factories where prisoners went to school 2 hours a day, They were in the factory 8 hours a day. Then they had an hour of recreation, and they ate. And my husband said to the head of the prison, "And what about prison violence?" He said, "Frankly, Judge," and my husband was a judge, "they're so tired at night that they fall asleep." Well, at any rate, gradually Moo began to fit in, and all of a sudden my husband and I got invited to a reception for the new ambassador from China to Los Angeles. There was one in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C. Well, my husband had to be in court, but I went, and there were about 1,000 people there. And I went down the receiving line, and he said, "Ambassador Mrs. Ma, this is Judge Dorothy Nelson." Immediately, Ambassador Ma said, "Oh, Judge Nelson, Mu Danping's friend." That's when I knew she was more than just a visiting professor. Next day, Mu calls me and said, "Ambassador Ma and his 4 vice consuls and their wives wish to come to your house to dinner." I said, "My house?" She says, "Yes, Judge, and you should have him if he's willing to come." That was a Monday, and I said, "Well, when did he have in mind?" "This Saturday, he's available." I said, "Boo, let me speak to my husband." So I called home. At that time, my husband's mother was living with us. His father had died. I had children at home, and my dear husband said, "Why not?" So the evening, the ambassador and Mrs. Ma came, and their 4 vice consuls and their wives. He walks in the door. I said, "Good evening, Judge Nelson. I believe in consultation, not confrontation. That is your belief." I said, "But yes, Ambassador Ma, but how did you know that?" When I'd had my students to my house to dinner, I had the promise of world peace in multi-languages. One of them was Mandarin. Unbeknownst to me, Mu had sent it home to Beijing. It had been published in the largest newspaper in Beijing from beginning to end. I was shocked to hear this because the faith was not recognized in China, and I didn't want to get anybody in trouble. And I called the Universal House of Justice and explained what had happened. Well, the Monday after the Saturday dinner, Mu calls and said, "Ambassador Ma wishes to meet with federal judges." And I said, "Well, I can't do that this week, Mu." He doesn't want to bring the wives, but just the vice consuls and Ambassador Ma. Well, in June of that year, before Tiananmen, I arranged for 12 federal judges to have lunch down here. I brought my silver, I brought my china. We had a lovely lunch. One of the judges said, "Ambassador Ma, how may we help China?" And he said, "Well, I want the Judges Nelson to come and set up plans for exchanges with your judges and ours." Well, that was a surprise to me. And right after lunch, he said, "We would love you and your husband to come. You've been a law school dean, you're both judges, and we are reviving the law schools, and we're reviving judicial education." Then Tiananmen happened. Ambassador Ma and his vice consuls were recalled to China. August of that year, he came back and he had Jim and me to his house to dinner, Jim, my husband, and said, "Will you still come?" Well, everybody had canceled because of Tiananmen. And I said, "Ambassador Ma, we will come if we may say what we think. As we're Baha'is, as you know, we do not engage in partisan politics at all. But if I want to say something about what might improve the judicial system, I want to be free to say what I really believe." "Oh, you will be free to believe it." I said, "I'm also very interested in mediation as it's done in China, and I would like to make studies of it and visit mediators. We will arrange it." So in October and November, of 1989, Jim and I spent a month in China. We were treated like royalty. We were guests of the Supreme People's Court. It gave us a banquet in the Great Hall, invited all the ministers of justice. We spent several days with the Supreme People's Court. The Supreme People's Court has about 1,500 members, but there are about 15 who are like our Supreme Court. Jim and I met with them talking about law reform, everything from criminal law, bankruptcy, and so forth. And all of a sudden, I noticed a man sitting in the corner. He wasn't introduced to us. And I said, President Wren, we haven't been introduced to this gentleman. I had gotten up my courage. We had been there about 9 days. Could you tell us who this gentleman is? And he said, oh, well, Judge Nelson, I don't think you would approve. He's our political consultant, and he reviews our opinions for political correctness. And I said, I think that you're right about that, President Wren. At any rate, we then went to Dalian. On the way to Dalian, we of course talked to the House of Justice before we went. And they said, bring very few Baha'i books, nothing dealing with administration. Bring the hidden words, bring gleanings, and so forth. Be very, very careful. Because, I say this because we ran into some well-meaning Baha'i youth who were not careful. And it was because of Ambassador Ma we called home and bailed them out of jail. But at any rate, when we got to Dalian, the chief judge met us at the airport in Nike tennis shoes, jeans, and a t-shirt, and he and my husband bonded like that. And Chief Judge Wang had gone to law school 1 year in California at Hastings Law School. So we went to his beautiful new courthouse, went up to the 17th floor, and since we were so friendly, I said, all right, Judge Wong, where is your political advisor? He said, oh, you know about him. And he let me tell you what we've done. And we went all the way down to what I call the basement. He called the lower level. Nice suite of offices, because space in China is at a premium. He said somehow we never see him and he never sees us, and we both like it that way. Well, the next time I went to China, I brought along 2 Baha'is with me, one who had her doctorate in Chinese studies and her law degree, another had her law degree, and both spoke fluent Chinese. We were taken to dinner by the mayor of Shanghai. You could tell he didn't really want to take us to dinner, but he was told to take us to dinner. And the first thing he said, why you bring 2 young people with you? I'd also brought 3 other elderly people, 2 of them judges. I said, if we're to have peace in the world, we must bring our best and brightest to learn about each other. And I turned to one of the Baha'is, Donna Gigi, and said, ask the dean, the president of the law school, who was there, a question in Mandarin. She did. Well, then the mayor said, ho, 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 come, sit next to me. The other Baha'i asked a similarly very good question, and ho, 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 come sit next to me. The next day we were to have a free day, but under the door at night, an invitation was to go to the Shanghai Law School of 500 students the next day, with particularly the young people. We would meet with the master's class. They all, quote, spoke English. I'm glad we had our translators with us. This amazing man had a roller skating rink, he wanted healthy law students, and we conducted this seminar, after which he invited both of the young Baha'is to come and teach for a semester, and foreign visitors were put up in motel-like rooms with indoor plumbing and kitchens and the like. At any rate, that was a wonderful experience, and all of us have kept in touch with our friends there. But the last special experience was in Kunming, a little town of about 60 million, had a brand new courthouse. And we were talking about the use of mediation and how I really believed in it. And he said, well, come to my courthouse. We walked up the marble steps, opened the doors, mediation wing to the right, court wing to the left. Nobody wanted to go to mediation because they all wanted to go to the new courthouse. So the chief judge had figured out a way to do it, which for which I commended him. He said, Judge Nelson, you're going to like this. And I said, I like it very much indeed. But it was a wonderful way. I think we had things to offer about true mediation, because in China, in many areas, it tended to be the older retired woman and her friends who were elected to the mediation committee. And true mediation, like true consultation, the parties participate in finding a solution. And so, the following year, I brought a team with a video of a typical good, there's so many bad ones, American mediation, and we've set up correspondence and been in touch ever since. One of my most interesting trips as a Baha'i, and because I was a Baha'i, was to India. And in 1985, I was invited to participate in a conference on transition to a global society. And the reason I was invited was that a Baha'i counselor, Zina Zarabji's husband, who was not a Baha'i, was Solicitor General of India. He had planned this 3-day program with for judges, lawyers, and doctors, really on the professions as the conscience of society. She looked at his program and said, you don't have any women. And she said, he said, I don't know any women to invite. She said, I know someone to invite, and that's really how I got invited. But what was nice when I addressed the conference, the Chief Justice, who became a very dear friend and later visited at my law school, when he introduced me, he said, the most interesting thing about Judge Nelson is that she is a Baha'i. Now, nowhere in the United States would I ever be introduced like that. But it opened many doors. And in the State Department found out I was there, the United States State Department, and wanted me to meet with various people, which I did. And when we went to Bombay, the Baha'is there, the Zarabji daughter, who is a lawyer, had set up with the Supreme Court in Bombay. The State Department of the United States said to me, no, we set up a meeting with them on the very next day, so cancel your Baha'i meeting. And I said, I won't do that. They said, but they won't come 2 days in a row. I said, so be it. So the one sponsored by the Baha'is, a lovely dinner, the chief in Bombay said, we're also interested that you're a Baha'i. Will you tell us how you became a Baha'i and a little bit about the Baha'i faith? As you know, there are close to 2 million Baha'is in India. So I did. The next night, they all showed up again. The dinner sponsored by the State Department. And I smiled at our State Department representative. The chief got up again. You didn't finish your story last night. Would you tell us more about what it means to be a Baha'i in the United States and what it means to be a Baha'i as a judge? Well, I go to Calcutta, and I spoke to a group of university students. One student got up and said, your country has, crooks and crime and so forth is, what are you doing here telling us about how we should have a legal system? I said, I'm not telling you how to have a legal system. I'm here to share ideas. Well, the State Department man interrupted and said she doesn't have to answer questions like that. And I said, that's why I'm here. I'm happy to answer the questions. The next morning, I was in my hotel room, and I got a message that about 20 students wanted to come and meet with me. I had time that morning. I ordered orange juice for everybody. We sat out on the patio, and you know, Calcutta was primarily communistic, and many of these students were trained as communists and would ask some very sharp questions that were very good questions that needed to be discussed. And one of them said, we're not used to people letting us discuss things like this. And I said, that's the joy I have in America. I can discuss these things any place I want to go. Well, of those 20 students, I think 11 of them wrote to me to thank me and say, and of course they all want to come to America. That's always true in China too. They always wanted to go. But then I was set up in Hyderabad to meet with a group of social workers. And there were about 200 there, and I went into this room, and just as I was about to take the podium, a woman came in sobbing and crying. And so I stepped down, there was water there. I said, are you all right? Would you like something? She said, no, I had 7 bride burnings today, and I didn't save a one. In India, when the bride brings the dowry and it runs out, then either more dowry has to come, or oftentimes the bride is set on fire, immolated. It's happening to this very day. So I tried to comfort the woman, and then I got up and talked about the role of women in society. And I think what is transforming India is the elevation of women, the training of women. The Baha'is have hundreds of schools where men and women attend. And as I know, when we were there before I was there before the House of Worship was finished, and so traveled around India. And then my husband came too, and you go to a Baha'i village, men and women were in the fields. Men and women were teachers. You go to a non-Baha'i village, the men are sitting around drinking coffee or tea, the women are in the fields, the girls are not in school, and I think education is going to change everything. So it was sort of nice to see the impact that the Baha'i faith had in these various areas in India. But what was so much fun, when the dedication of the Baha'i House of Worship in New Delhi came about, the Chief Justice of India was invited. Hundreds wanted to go to the dinner afterwards. Jim and I were representing the United States of America National Assembly. But one of the Indian ladies said, you know, we really don't have a lot of room. Do you really want to come? And I said, well, I don't want to displace anybody, but I feel a duty to represent the United States. So they put us way down at the end of the room. The Chief Justice comes in and says, where are the judges, Nelson? And Rahia Khanum was there. She said, go get the judges, Nelson. And they went down to the end of the room, brought them, I want them to sit with the Chief Justice next to me. And we had the most wonderful discussion about India, about the law, and Rahia Khanum charmed the Chief Justice. So the very next year, I invited the Chief Justice to this country. He stayed in our home. I had him address a bar association and the law school. But you know where he wanted to go? I offered the symphony. There were wonderful plays down at our music center. He wanted to go to Disneyland. So we've ended up fast friends and still are fast friends. Now, many of my friends ask me, do any of my fellow judges know about the Baha'i faith? Yes, several have come to Baha'i firesides. But one of my most interesting experiences was in Weimar, Switzerland, at Landeg Academy, a Baha'i academy. It was the third international dialogue on transition to a global society. This was in 1992. I was co-chair, and with Iraj Abon, and Iraj said, you bring judges from America, we'll bring judges from 14 other countries. One of my former colleagues on my court, which is the United States Court of Appeals, went to the Supreme Court, Anthony Kennedy, who was a very good friend. And I called up, I said, Tony, how would you and your wife, Mary, like to come to Switzerland for a week? All you have to do is give a talk and participate in some seminars. He said, well, Switzerland sounds pretty good to me. Let me check with Mary and we'll come. So I had Justice Anthony Kennedy of the United States Supreme Court coming. And then one of my good friends, an African-American friend, Leon Higginbotham, who is now deceased. Leon and I were appointed by the president to a couple of commissions together. His daughter was the same age as my daughter, and so we became very good friends at a number of commissions that we worked on. So I called Leon, and I said, Leon, how would you like to go to Weimar, Switzerland for a week with your wife? He said, sounds good to me. I did not tell either one that I had invited the other when the program came out. And Justice Kennedy saw that Leon Higginbotham had been invited. He called me up and said, Dorothy, you didn't tell me you had invited Leon Higginbotham. I am sort of angry at him for the editorial he wrote for the New York Times about the confirmation of one of our judges. I shall remain nameless. Leon calls me and said, Dorothy, you didn't tell me you invited Justice Kennedy. Well, to make a long story short, we go to Switzerland, Landeg Academy, which was then owned by the Baha'is, a beautiful place. Justice Kennedy was the speaker the very first day, and I was chair. It was what should be in world constitutions. And Justice Kennedy said only political and civil rights, not social and economic rights. Judge Higginbotham raised his hand. Mr. Justice Kennedy, what good does it do for a woman to have the right to vote if she has no education? Nervous laughter around the room. There were about 60 there. Iraj looked at me, do something. Then Mrs. Kennedy, the wife of Justice Kennedy, a former school teacher, spoke up. She said, you know, I agree with Judge Higginbotham. Well, all that week, Jim and I carefully stayed with the two judges, the one the justice, the other the judge of the Court of Appeals. But every evening, Sohail Bushri, who is a holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace, and his daughter, would have a night of poetry and prose. Justice Kennedy and Judge Higginbotham were so taken with Professor Bushri that they began talking back and forth to each other all these evenings. The day we were to depart, Justice and Mrs. Kennedy were in the lobby, and in came Judge and Mrs. Higginbotham. Justice Kennedy went up to Judge Higginbotham and said, you know, Leon, I grew up in Sacramento and I never knew any black people. We've so enjoyed our time with you. May we consider you our first black friends? And they embraced. And I said to my husband, that's what seminars are all about. But even more importantly to me, in October of that year, Justice Kennedy granted the first writ of habeas corpus calling for a new trial for a man who claimed he had a racially biased trial. That was the first one he'd ever granted, and I said to my husband, that's what seminars are all about. So, through seminars and through people getting to know each other, it seems that the world could change overnight if we just made up our minds to do it. There's this wonderful statement of the Universal House of Justice, the promise of world peace. And in it says we could have world peace tomorrow, or through an act of consultative will, or through unimaginable horrors. And Jim and I were privileged to present it to members of the Supreme Court. And we're so warmly received by members of the Supreme Court. One of the justices' first secretary, Justice Stevens, had been a Baha'i, and these are the kinds of experiences that I've had because I'm a Baha'i, and not just because I'm a judge. When I was a young law professor at the University of Southern California, I started teaching in 1957 as the first woman on the faculty, so I had a sabbatical in 1965. I chose to go to Israel because I wanted to see the World Center, but I chose the subject of studying the laws of marriage and divorce. It was the rabbinical laws, the Christian laws, the Sharia, Muslim laws, and Baha'i administration. We took our children, ages 4 and 7, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. It was early in the administration of the faith by the Universal House of Justice. House of Justice members would even wash the windows of where we were supposed to stay before we came. And a wonderful experience for our children. Our children, Mr. Fazy had a children's school on Saturdays, which was Shabbat, where American mothers wouldn't approve, but they would go into his room and he had big bags full of candy that they reach in and take them, and he taught them in the most wonderful way. He would use postcards, a beautiful rose. What does this mean to you? A picture of the shrine of the Bab. And they were children, I'd say, from ages 4 to 12. And they would come back and talk seriously about these things. Then he believed in having fun. And my son had a slight ear infection. And Mr. Fazy was going to take them swimming in these pools that were about a half hour out of Haifa. Well, we were with Mr. and Mrs. Wolcott, and they were taking us to Bethlehem. And on the way back, we saw Mr. Fazy at his little Volkswagen, our 2 children and a couple other children with him, and they stopped. Well, my son stayed in the car. I said, Franklin, you look a little wet to me. He said, well, Mother, Mr. Fazy said it's okay if I put my feet in. Then it was okay if I let it up to my knees. And then all of a sudden I feel, and he said, it's okay, you'll be all right. But it was a joyous time for my children. But at that time, Jim and I were asked to begin work on the notes for the Kitab Yaqdas. It was going to be, it had not been published in English, and there was going to be a summary edition before it was published. But there were various sections. We had one paragraph on the law of marriage and divorce with 200 questions asked to Abdul Baha, questions and answers, all the research materials. For the next 15 years, we worked on that one paragraph. And of course, the House of Justice is so thorough on everything. There were probably about 20 other people working on that same paragraph. And when we were finally finished, I thought, oh boy, it's going to come out next year. Well, it was 20 years later when the Kitab Yaqdas came out. But we went to the international conventions, and each time had the privilege of, when there weren't a lot of people there, staying all night in Baji. Mr. Fazey would let the kids go out and pick grapefruit. They put on happy faces and serve us all at dinner. Then, one night in Baji, it was storming and the roof leaked. This is in the early 70s, and we all came out of our bedrooms, had pans that caught the water, and then Mr. Fazey would tell us stories of Baha'u'llah. Those were times in our lives that gave us the roots that we really, really appreciated the longer we became Baha'is. Having been raised as Christians, we had roots there. But even visiting the Shrine of the Bab, when I had my 4-year-old and my 7-year-old, I said to Mr. Fazey, I will stay outside with my daughter so she won't disturb anybody. No, he said. And he reached for his hand, and she looked up and walked in. Well, we're in the Shrine of the Bab, and all of a sudden, I hear this little voice, greater is God than every great one. Mr. Fazey turned and looked at me and said, we underestimate the spirituality of our own children. So we learned many lessons there that have stuck with us all of our lives. And the other was watching the dedication of the members of the House of Justice and their spouses to go shopping with Harriet Wolcott, who had grown up in quite a lovely home, who had servants and so forth, go out with her little bag and go down to the docks and bargain for things. Pick up a live chicken, stick it in the bag, pick up a big loaf of bread, stick it in another bag, and so forth, and come back, and she had never been happier in her entire life. To see the dedication, it was an example of selfless service. And in fact, Charles Wolcott, many people will know, was a great musician, and how they planned music nights where they would come and just play beautiful music, say some prayers, but not excessively so, he said. Sometimes people just need a touch, and it will touch their hearts more than hours and hours of reading and memorizing and the like. Then we became, when we came time and again, to work on the status agreement with Israel. No religion had ever had a status agreement with Israel to protect our properties, to come to some agreement that there be no taxation of our properties and the like. Happily, the president of my law school class, who had first introduced us to the faith, became the general counsel for the House of Justice. So we would go to Jerusalem, meet with the ministers of justice, meet with the officials every time that we would go. In fact, I was on my way to Africa one time to a conference, had 3 days in Israel, and we stopped off in Israel, I guess it was on a Sunday, and a note under my door, the House of Justice wishes you to go to Jerusalem to meet with the following people. I came back to 3 days, we would leave the next morning, and Ali Nachavani came and said, I'm taking you out to Baji. He gave me the keys to the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. I'll pick you up in 3 hours. I went in the shrine and then would walk out in the gardens, and the cactus garden needed weeding, so I weeded the cactus garden, came back in the shrines. Ali picked me up and said, "You're having dinner with Rahia Khanum tonight." I said, "Oh no, I would not do that. I would not impose on it. It is done." And that began a wonderful relationship with Rahia Khanum. She cooked a dinner that my mother used to cook on Sundays. She had pot roast. She had cauliflower with cheese sauce and so forth. And then she took me into her kitchen. She loved gadgets. And she had this big pegboard, every gadget known to man. So every time I went to Haifa, I would scour every store I could to find some unique and new gadget. Well, what this did, it humanized everybody, for me and for Jim. And we felt so deeply rooted in the faith each time we would come home. And still are in touch with our friends in Israel. So much so that the Minister of Justice, Minister Gabai, called me one time on a Wednesday, said, "Judge Nelson, I'm in town. Let's go to dinner, you and Jim and I." I said, "Oh, Justice Gabai, this is our fireside night. I'll give the fireside." He came, I canceled our speaker, gave the most wonderful fireside about what the Baha'i faith had done for Israel. And so it was just a wonderful experience. I heard about the faith in law school. And so when I I graduated, there were only 2 women in my class, and a major law firm made me an offer, which was unusual. No one expected anyone to hire a woman. But one of my professors was the former dean of the Harvard Law School, Roscoe Pound, one of the great legal thinkers in America. He recommended me for a research position at the University of Southern California, our rival university, on how to improve the court system. One paid $250 a month. This is 1953. The other paid $350 a month. My husband said, "I know what you want to do it." I wasn't ready to go work for a law firm as wonderful and as prestigious as that law firm was. Because in law school, I was very bothered by the adversary system. It was too costly, it was too painful, it was too destructive, it was too inefficient to me for a truly civilized society. So when I became a Baha'i and began to study about what consultation in the Baha'i faith meant, I thought, aha, here is my way to help change the system. And so when I taught my first course, I did a research project on how to improve the court system in Los Angeles County, a small comparative study with San Francisco and San Diego. We recommended 33 changes to the state legislature, 2 of which were not adopted. The rest were. How to better administer the courts, how to give greater access to justice, and the like. I was asked to fill in for a professor called to Europe, and I had been in his seminar, which was not as well taught as it might have been. At the end of the semester, the students went into the dean and said, "Hire her, hire her." The dean, laughingly, I'm happy to say, said, "But she's a woman." And I got hired. And I added to my course on law reform the closest thing to consultation that I could think of, mediation. And in Sunday school, when we used to teach the kids, consultation means finding out what everybody is thinking about. You listen to them, they listen to you, you all do what most of you want to do. That's basically what good mediation is about. And at that first faculty meeting, I heard at the end of the table, "What is Dorothy teaching?" "Mediation. That's not law." And the answer was, "Oh, she's just trying to make people love each other." Well, it gives me such pleasure to say that mediation is the hottest topic in the court system, not only in this country, but around the world. I went to a conference in London early on when I was teaching in the 80s. The American Bar met there, and we had a panel on mediation. And they put us in a room that would seat 50 people. 600 showed up. People from all over the world, people from all over America, looking for better ways to resolve conflict. So it was a happy thing for me that I had a wonderful dean. I never, ever felt discriminated against. But I had to learn that that wasn't always the case. And there were very few women in the law school when I became a faculty member. And when I became first assistant dean and then associate dean and then dean, we set out to change that. And by the time I left my deanship, we were close to 50% women. And it made a different conversation in the classroom. Women had different things to offer when you talk about equal protection of the laws and due process of law. And you talk about our immigration laws, where immigration judges will say to immigrants, "Oh, you've been here 25 years, you have no criminal record, and your children are 14, 15, and 17. They're old enough to take care of themselves. They've all been born here. They don't speak Spanish, and yet they're going to deport. They want to deport the parents and say that teenagers can take care of themselves." I would say that most women would take issue with that particular statement because the standard is, will it be extreme hardship? So I had very compatible faculty. I was very interested in the students. I was very concerned about the extreme competitiveness in law school. And I didn't start out well in law school myself. And when I didn't do that well, and this Dean Pound looked at my papers, he just began to laugh and said, "You're just showing how much you know, but you're not answering the question." So when I became associate dean, I asked all faculty to give practice exams to their students and grade them. It was all voluntary, and if they didn't, sometimes I would step in and do it myself, trying to get students themselves to figure out their purpose in life. Why am I here? Where am I going? Instead of trying to copy what other people are doing or look like the hard-working, stay-up all-nighters, instead of talking about why are we going to law school, what do we want to be when we grow up, and also including their spouses, which for the most part were women in those days. And we began holding meetings with this wonderful psychiatrist from the medical school who would sit and talk to the students and let them raise their own problems. Well, we began having wonderful, we would find that the degree of tension in the law school was incredibly reduced. And I could just see all sorts of things where students could do things, and some of the very best students were shy, scared, etc. We set up mentoring programs. We did all sorts of fun things that you could see a result and see lives changing. Not necessarily people raising their grade levels much higher, but much happier human beings. The dropout rate used to be tremendous. As you look to the right of you, look to the left of you, they'd say to a first-year class, "Only one of you will be here next year." Well, we tried to take the fear out of education, and we began expanding clinics so they go out and meet real clients. When we began to take minority students, well, they wanted to take courses involving race relations. When they went out in those courses were good, but when they went out in the clinics, they came back and said, gosh, we need to know the rules of evidence and procedure if we're going to help these people. So at any rate, I think being a Baha'i sort of liberated me for trying to be like everybody ahead of me. I was a happy wife. I had some faculty who I felt were very suspicious of why I should be to my house to dinner, to see my children, to see my husband, and so forth. I began serving food at faculty meetings so that people would socialize with each other. There were just so many opportunities where you could do fun things to make a real difference in how people felt about themselves and what they wanted to be. So I attribute that, a lot of that, to the faith, because the faith helped me to focus on, why am I here? Or where am I going? Do I want to be president of the United States? No. What do I want to be? And I'd always come up with the answer, I want to build a community and be in a community that is built on unity and diversity, love and caring for each other, and how to make it better. I was always concerned with, in various courses, I was just outraged at some of the cases. I was before desegregation. I was before Brown versus education. And I started out from being very shy in class to speaking up and saying, these are unspeakable kinds of things for us to be permitting in the courtrooms. So I finally got my voice in law school. I didn't have it at the beginning, but as a result of becoming a Baha'i, I followed my mentor, Don Barrett, who became general counsel for the House of Justice, in speaking up about things like equality of women and men, abolition of racism.